Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of an ongoing series where we basically take the camera anywhere we want to try to find secrets and new discoveries to some of our favorite games. And today, I'm covering a game I've never even played before. It's Pokémon Black. Lots of people thought that there would be nothing to see out of bounds because they don't realize that this game takes place in a 3D environment made to look like a pixel 2D. And so for this episode, we're going to be showcasing a lot of these developer techniques and also just a few weird out of bounds things that I found today. I think you're going to like it, so let's check it out. Okay, the first thing I want to talk about is how the world looks from a normal perspective. Usually Pokemon Black always has this eagle-eye view, and only in very rare instances does the camera angle ever shift. But in these cases, this is what all the characters look like if you were from the perspective of you standing in the environment yourself. So I got an amazing sponsor for you guys today. It is Arc System Works. Do you know who they are? Well, you should. They're the people that are behind the amazing Dragon Ball FighterZ game, as well as their own amazing fighting game franchise that is up there with some of the all-time greats, Guilty Gear. What Arc System Works is doing right now is they're having a Black Friday sale from November 17th to the 27th. Many of Arc System Works' games are going to be on sale at a fraction of the price. You can also enjoy a free season pass if you pre-order Under Night in Birth, Sis Celeste, which is their new fighting game coming out, and it looks fantastic. You can also get Blaze Blue Cross Tag Battle for 76% off, another fantastic fighter, as well as Double Dragon 4 for 50% off. Or you can go for the creme de la creme and you can get Guilty Gear Strive Daredevil Edition for 25% off, which, if you didn't know, Guilty Gear Strive is the newest entry in the Guilty Gear series, the 7th entry, and it features that amazing anime aesthetic for 3D models that you just will not find anywhere else on this caliber of art style accuracy. It really looks like an anime brought to life. And of course, it's Guilty Gear, so it's got amazing music, and players that are willing to invest themselves in the tight gameplay will be rewarded with a fighting game with deep gameplay mechanics. Again, this sale is running from November 17th to the 27th, and you can take advantage of this sale by clicking on my link in the description and the pinned comment. Thanks Arc System Works for the sponsorship. Your company is legendary. And with that said, let's get back to the show. All the characters sort of lean a little bit backwards. This is so that the character sprite can be pointed at the player and not present them from an angle that would be more on the top of their head. A lot of indoor environments use a ton of 3D. This classroom is a great example of that, where all the desks are basically 3D. The teacher's desk has a 3D vase but with 2D pixel flowers, and the chalkboard also has 3D depth along with a 3D eraser. You can also see things like the bench and chairs are fully 3D, but the indoor plant uses a 2D texture. The Pokemon Center is another great example of many different 3D models being used. Like the globe over here is a full 3D sphere, and those pods that you go into that are behind these NPCs are also fully 3D modeled. Same thing with this magazine rack and table. And the camera is incredibly restricted, so it becomes more of a game of finding out which models are half modeled and which models are fully modeled. Outdoor areas tend to lose their immersion very quickly because there's a lot of culling that is used in this game, as well as level of detail, but we'll get into that in just a second. Here I want to show you that certain buildings in this first town that you visit straight up cull out certain buildings that you're far enough away from. And speaking of outdoor environments, here's one of the most bizarre things I was able to find for this episode. The Ferris wheel, once again, adheres to a very strict camera. As you can see, the carriages that people step inside of are in the shape of Pokeballs, and they have more of a rounded shape. Moving the camera up, though, will show you a lot of bizarre things. First of all, the carriages do not animate all the way around the Ferris wheel, but there are carriages for each spot of where it would be on the Ferris wheel. And those carriages are not the original carriages. They are beta carriages that are in a 6-sided shape, and they don't move with the carriage. It just stays in place. You can actually see the exact moment in which the carriage that is used in-game loads in and loads out. It's really, really bizarre. Here's another really funny thing about perspective. In this gym, we have this concierge type person, and if you shift the camera out of its intended angle, you can see that the register that she stands near actually kind of towers over her and is not on the desk itself. And because of the angling of the sprite, she's straight up underneath it, which is some excellent use of forced perspective. Also, when you go outdoors, you might remember that there's some reflections in the water. The way that this is pulled off is that every sprite that gets a reflection gets its image doubled. There is a second entity of the sprite that just moves underneath the map, and then that second sprite is just sort of twisted and contorted to have a wavy effect. So this next one was incredibly fascinating. It is collision mapping, or possibly just a low poly version of an adjacent town before you go through those walkways. This example that I'm showing you right now is a fantastic one because it shows you all the slopes and everything without any textures applied to it. And it's just kind of fascinating that something like this is in a DS game of all things. And in here you don't get a whole lot of geometry, but this is really freaking cool. A lot of the 3D buildings that should be here are replaced with 2D boulders. In the Pokemon Soul Silver episode, there was these cubes, these like dev cubes, but for here, nah man, boulders. I'm just surprised that there's anything at all, to be honest with you. I guess they need a stand-in object in order for the game to function properly, but still. And now here's something that's really cool about Pokemon Black and White, is that all the Pokemon are animated. And since they're still sprites, they animate by layering different body parts on top of the Pokemon. Here's what I mean. If we turn the camera around on Tepig here, you can see the entire sprite layer for the base of Tepig's body, which on this side of things ends up covering up a lot of his face. In the case of Purloin, you can see the entirety of Purloin's neck, which also starts to cover up its eyes. And then for Lillipup, you can see the base of its body as well as a few extra pixels of its butt. For Passage, you can see that its eyes are a separate layer from its head, causing you to see the entirety of the face that is beneath those eyes, as well as the bush on its head is a completely separate sprite as well, looking like a full bush, as opposed to when you look at it from the front, where it sort of looks like it's a part of his hair. And then for Patrat, you can see that its mouth and nose are on a separate layer, and its body also has a lot more pixels going on than it shows in the front. Also, you can see the entirety of its tail. And then with Audino, you can see its entire tail as well, which looks like an entire puff, something that you can barely see on the sprite. And I just wanted to say that with Woobat, it's kind of interesting because if Woobat was the only Pokemon that you saw from the back and front in a video like this, you would think that maybe the developers designed a back and front for all these Pokemon, since Woobat's singular eye just sort of looks like a tuft in the back of its body here. Venipede is also super interesting because it also kind of gives this impression that it almost looks like it works fine from the back. The only thing that kind of messes up the illusion is its little feet. And Swadloon is super interesting because if we take the camera around to the back, we could see the little limbs that it has inside of its leaves, but only some of the time because the leaves also sort of clip into the back of this Pokemon. And of course, we'll top off this segment by just doing a zoom out of at least one of the battle arenas. And as you can see here, it has sort of like a half cylinder, and clearly it's massive because the little discs that your Pokemon and your opponent's Pokemon have to stand on is a perfect indicator for the scale of your Pokemon versus the size of the environment arena. Anyways, moving on, I just want to talk about how much is rendered at any given time in the world of Pokemon Black. Obviously, the camera is always sort of locked in at this length, but you might be surprised by just how much is loaded in at once. It's not a ton, don't get me wrong, it's not like the entire world is just there at once, but what I believe here is that the world just seems to cull out adjacent areas, and as your character will approach it, that adjacent area will just sort of cull in. It's kind of wild to think that the very first town that you ever walk in has an area that's much later in the game, completely loaded in over to your left as long as you walk towards it, which makes me very impressed by these old school Pokemon world designers, because clearly there's some care and concern about the cohesiveness of the worlds and how they connect together. That being said, here's a huge viewer request. These days you can find me over on my Discord channel. There you can talk to me about anything, whether it be things you want to see in future episodes you want to see, as well as just my general thoughts and opinions. Anyways, they want to know about this bridge because clearly it's a 3D model, and I think for an old school system like the DS, we just kind of want to see how long it takes before the camera perspective breaks the illusion. And as you can see, it doesn't take very long at all. There's no top of the bridge that's modeled, and in order to give it a sense of scale, what they truly did was they just sort of made everything kind of come to a point to give the illusion that there's a lot of distance here, when in fact there isn't. Also, the buildings far off in the distance are just 3 billboards layered in front of each other. And of course, then once you go inside and start walking on the path, there's this massive 3D environment, and sadly, it's not all loaded in at once. But this is another great example of what culling is. The collision for everything still exists in the game world, which is why you can see trucks just floating in the void. But truthfully, if you start walking towards that direction, you'll see the models for that collision start to cull back in. Also, I just want to talk about how this boat over here is a single entity that is supposed to represent multiple boats. And taking the camera and looking at it from this angle over here can show you the exact moment in which it warps from the end of this track onto the track that's supposed to make it look like another boat coming in from the right. Now here's a zoom out of Castelia City. This city is just a giant circle. And the camera likes to sort of spin around the circle to give it a huge sense of depth. But in truth, the roads and everything else like that do the same trick as that bridge that we talked about earlier, where to give it a sense of distance and depth, the lines for the road just sort of turn into a thin triangle. Also, the skyline is like a pair of wings that follow the player around, and in truth are just two large 2D textures. This road that you walk on is done in a completely different way. Again, you get a really fun perspective, one that's different from Pokemon of old, but taking the camera out will show you that all these buildings are not fully modeled. And also from this distance, the texture for those buildings sort of get a little bit screwed up. And then you can see that the windows that represent these buildings are actually one giant texture sheet that's placed just inside of the building, which is one of the most unusual techniques I've seen for buildings in video games. And now we're going to talk about a couple of scripted events because this can be really hilarious. Like with Bianca and Sharon here right at the very start of the game, these two characters actually have clones that exist in the same area. In fact, here's what that area looks like when it's loaded in properly. And now let's talk about layers with the phone calls, because this is also super interesting. So first of all, the eyes and mouths of these characters are on a separate layer. However, removing the layer for these eyes and mouths will just show you that they have another set of eyes and mouths. This is just so that they're allowed to blink and talk if they so choose, but the art team still made the faces on the original character portraits regardless. Also, removing layers further can show you that there's a snow screen that's hidden behind the background layer at all times. Yes, this snow screen is used at later parts of the game, but it's still wild that at any given phone call, you can find this snow screen in any of them. This even includes phone calls where it's just two people, like with your mom here. This one's just kind of stupid fun for you guys. There's a cheat that I've been using from time to time that allows me to walk through walls, but a very funny byproduct of that is that character NPCs also lose collision with walls as well. So these two Pokemon here that normally rely on collision data to walk in a perfect square will just suddenly run off. It will not stop running in that direction until there is a different type of collision data that the code does not account for. Also, that Dragonite fossil skeleton is fully modeled, and the skull has a texture that wraps around the entire model. And the evolution screen. Now, this is a little bit bizarre. Taking the camera out can show you that there's a half cylinder that represents the background for when you evolve a Pokemon. But for whatever reason, behind the camera is a duplicate background screen as well. And I will confirm that no, this second background is not used while you're evolving your Pokemon. And how about when you choose your Pokemon for the first time? Those Pokeballs in that box is all a 3D environment. So taking the camera out will show you just how massive the room is that houses this one little model that's only used one time. And sadly, we have to stop the video for now. I was on a really tight time crunch with this one, but if there's clearly a lot of people that piled in for this video, I promise to come back to Pokemon Black and show you even more areas and hopefully find some more stuff that's out of bounds. For those of you who have not subscribed yet, the next episode is going to be Super Mario RPG Remake, so if you're interested in that, please tune in for the next one. If you're just a Pokemon fan though, I got a Pokemon Soul Silver episode on the screen right now. Thank you guys so much for watching and take care.